Boy, have we got a panel for you. I'm Chris Littleton. I'm the Vice Provost for Diversity and Faculty Development here at UCLA. Very pleased to be part of this whole arrangement. And those of you who have heard me this morning, part of the reason I'm here is to let you know how much the entire campus benefits from having symposia like this, and that these are important things, not only for the law school, but for the entire campus and the entire community. So welcome, welcome, welcome. We unfortunately lost one person on our way here. Catherine Pratt, who is the commissioner and who oversees the STAR Court, which is the very interesting experimental program, has the flu, and so we had to say, okay, you don't have to come with the flu. We're not that friendly. But one of the people who has a fellowship there at the Star Court, Allison Newcomb, is here. Can you stand up, Allison? If you have any questions about it, look at the bio for Catherine Pratt, look at how interesting this program is, and ask Allison after during the break or afterwards if you're interested in this particular program. And she will give you, she'll tell you everything, right? Yeah, thank you very much. Now, this is a panel to die for. I'm reading the bios and I'm thinking, oh my God, do I really dare to introduce these people? Well, of course. Anyway, I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they will be speaking. Right here in the middle is Ángeles Zaragoza.
Got it.
And Ángeles is a Deputy Alternative Public Defender for Los Angeles County. She's in the Van Nuys office. She manages a misdemeanor caseload, and before that, she worked as an Assistant Federal Defender for the Eastern District of California, handling felony cases. So she has a good background in both of those. Also, she's worked with the Sacramento County Public Defender, and she staffed a medical legal community partnership for neighborhood legal services of LA County. Through that position, served as an on-site attorney for low-income folks and a low-income clinic in Sun Valley. She is a UCLA Law School alum from the Public Interest Program and the Critical Race Studies Program, two of our signature programs here at UCLA. And she, during law school, she was awarded the Cesar Chavez Fellowship and spent both summers at the Learning Rights Center, right? Which is, so, what a bio. And then, we have Ann Gannon here, who will speak second. She's currently an assistant U.S. attorney in the Central District of California. We are well represented in California. She coordinates federal child exploitation investigations and prosecutions in Orange County as part of the U.S. Department of Justice's Safe Childhood program. She's indicted dozens of cases involving the victimization of women and children and handled 13 child exploitation appeals before the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. She also, at one point, not too long ago, was assigned to Washington, D.C., where she was served as the National Coordinator for Child Exploitation Prevention and Interdiction in the Office of the Deputy Attorney General. And just one of several of our panelists who have actually been invited to the White House for in this case, for a human trafficking survivor forum. She's testified before the UN Council on the Protection of the Child, on the Committee of the Rights for the Child. Did her undergraduate work at the University of California in Berkeley.
Go Bears. I know that's super dangerous in this crowd, but I can resist.
Bears, Bruins, what's the difference? We're all part of this UC. And she got her law degree from Notre Dame. And then we have Martha Dane, Meredith Dane on the end here. Meredith Dank. I'm determined to get your name right.
It's really
Meredith
easy name,
Dank,
too.
as a senior researcher with the Urban Institute's Justice Policy Center. Areas of focus include commercial sex economy, human trafficking, teen dating violence, LGBTQ issues, and victimization. She served as principal investigator on 2 studies that were overseen by the DOJ, the Department of Justice. One, a first of its kind effort to measure the underground commercial sex industry. The underground commercial sex industry is not so easy. And and also the other one was to understand the juvenile justice system interactions and experiences of LGBTQ youth. As an expert in human trafficking, she has conducted research in 8 countries, including Cambodia, Sierra Leone, and the Philippines. Logging a lot of frequent flyer miles. Holds a PhD in criminal justice from John Jay College, and divides her time between Washington, D.C. and New York, and today, California, and the author of The Commercial Sexual Exploitation of Children from LFB Publishing, published in 2011. And guess who's going to then try to comment on all of these? Bianca Wilson, I'm glad I'm not doing, who is the discussant. Bianca is the senior scholar of public policy at the Williams Institute here at UCLA in the law school, which is the premier and, in fact, the only think tank for LGBTQ issues, law and policy in the U.S., and was founded, 15 years ago, wasn't it? Anyway, the Williams Institute has been fabulously successful, and she received her PhD in psychology from the University of Illinois in Chicago, and then went on to get postdoc training at UC San Francisco and the Institute for Health Policy Studies, and also at UC San Francisco in Lesbian Health and Research Center. All of this through an Agency for Health Research and Quality postdoctoral fellowship. Our folks are very wise. She studies youth in foster care and also the demographics and outcomes for same-sex couples using census data and other data. It's a lot of wading through statistics to find the nuggets that tell us what is actually happening. So this is our panel. I'm going to go sit over there so I can listen, and I will let them take it away.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I'd like to thank you for that introduction and for doing your best to get my name right. It's a tough one. It's Angeles, like Los Angeles. I say that like every day. Before I begin, I want to really give it up to the organizers, Claudia and Beth, and the students for putting this on. I was fortunate enough to catch the last session, and it's really amazing that you all have been able to bring together such an exceptional group of people. And I'm just really blown away, and I just want to thank you guys for all your work and your efforts. When I got a phone call from Beth originally asking me to join this panel, and she talked to me about these lovely ladies here, and I'm just like, how do I fit into this? I'm a public defender. What do I have to contribute to this? I didn't really get it at first. And the more that Beth and I spoke, I could hear her excitement about what I was saying, just talking to her about my day-to-day work. And at the end of the conversation, she was like, this is really an opportunity for you to serve as a voice for your clients. Even though your perspective is a little different because your role may be a little different, it's your opportunity to really voice what my clients go through. And I was like, okay, that's really important. I need to do that, but give me a day to think about it. The next day, I go into my courtroom, and the public defender, I'm with the alternate public defender. I'm a county office, but it's a little different, smaller than the regular public defender's office. The public defender in my courtroom had a stack of cases, and she was super busy running around like crazy. And she stopped me in the courtroom, and she was like, oh my God, I had a dream about you last night. And I'm like, really? And she's like, yeah, and we were helping one of our prostitution clients out in Santa Monica. And I'm like, if that isn't a sign, I don't know what is. And so I emailed Beth, and I'm like, sign me up, I'll do it. So that is why I am here today, and I'm really proud to be a part of this panel. So as Chris mentioned, I was a public defender out in Sacramento County before becoming a federal public defender and then making my way back down to LA with the alternate public defender's office. And something that was really striking to me and coming back to LA County, and that was really surprising to me, is how many of my cases are women that are being charged with prostitution or solicitation for prostitution. Sacramento County, for whatever reason, I don't know why, we didn't handle these types of cases there. They're not prioritized, or they weren't prioritized a few years ago when I was there. They weren't a priority of law enforcement. Maybe arrests were made, but no, there were no filings that came about from those arrests. But it wasn't something that the city attorney and the district attorney's office prioritized up there. So I didn't handle any prostitution cases my time that I was with the county, which was only a year. But I think it's really telling compared to my experiences here in LA County. And so coming down to LA, I thought I'm going into this, urban environment. It has to be more progressive, liberal. So it's been very surprising to see the types of cases that are prosecuted down here, including solicitation for prostitution and prostitution cases. Another thing that's been very surprising is to see the great amount of prostitution stings in LA County. In my arraignment court, at least twice a week, I look into lockup, and it's crowded with predominantly young women of color, black and brown women, who are crowding the courtrooms with these types of charges. And so it's been quite an adjustment for me over the year and a half that I've been back in LA practicing for the first time as a public defender down here. And before I continue, I just want to say that as a public defender, my role is very narrow. Like I said, I'm handling situations where people are coming in who have been arrested and are dealing with criminal charges, okay? And so that's how I think the perspective is a little different for some of you who may have been here for the prior panel discussion as well, in that my clients don't necessarily voice to me that they are victims at the hands of, a pimp or anyone else like that is forcing them to do what they're doing and keeping them on the streets. It's not really something that, for whatever reason, they go into with me. I'm there trying to put out a fire. And, so those aren't things that I necessarily explore. And maybe that's something that I need to do different in my practice. And I need more training. And I look forward to opportunities to learn what I can be doing better as a public defender with that regard. And so when my clients talk about their own victimization, it's about them being victims to law enforcement on the street, to prosecutors in the courtroom, to judges in the courtroom. In their eyes, as far as their conversations with me, that's how they are being victimized by the criminal justice system as a whole. And so, we have had the occasional client who has come in and who has said, you know what, I did this one time and my boyfriend got me into it. And so there is the occasional client that goes there with us. But like I said, for the most part, that isn't really a part of the conversation that I'm having with my clients when I'm dealing with their criminal matter. So in thinking about how to best kind of illustrate the challenges that my clients face, both on the street and once they're in the system, a particular client kept coming to mind. And I think it's important for me to share with you her story because I think it really sheds light on the various challenges that she encountered. I'll refer to her as Carmen. Carmen was my client about a year ago out of the East LA courthouse. And she came in, she had already been arraigned. She knew she was facing a couple of charges of solicitation for prostitution. She had a criminal record, so she had prior convictions for solicitation and prostitution on her record. She's about in her mid-30s, a transgender woman, and Latina. And in speaking to her, You know, what I do with all my clients, I go through, I tell them what their charges are, I tell them what the offer is, and we go through the police report together. And the way I like to do it, I like for them to not interrupt me. I read the entire police report, and then I give them an opportunity to go through and tell me, you know, their version of what happened. And so I'm going through it with her, and I'm talking to her about it. The offer for her, because she had so many priors, and this is a common offer now for women, individuals who have priors on their record, it was a maxed out offer of 180 days jail, no probation. And so I delivered that news to her, and she immediately begins to become emotional, and she's like, I can't go back to jail. I can't go back in there. These jails are not equipped to deal with transgender individuals. Like, I don't feel safe in custody. I can't go back. And she was terrified at the idea of going back into jail. And after I reviewed the police report with her, she said to me, let me tell you what happened that day. That's not what happened that day. Let me tell you what happened that day. She was at the local 7-Eleven in her neighborhood. She had walked over there and had stepped outside and was making a phone call. And she saw a car parked in front of her, and she recognized the individual in the vehicle. And it was actually an officer that she recognized and who happened to be undercover. And she recognized this officer because this officer was a client of hers. And he called her over to his car, and she got inside, and she's having a conversation with him. And everything was going kind of normal between the two of them until the moment that he told her how much he would pay her for a particular service. And the amount that he told her he would pay her was different from the usual amount that he would pay her. And so she immediately felt uncomfortable, and sure enough, a few minutes later, she was being arrested, and it was a sting. And several officers came out, and she was arrested and taken into custody, eventually cited out, and now has this case before me that we're trying to deal with. And so she's telling me all this, and she begins to tell me other stories of times that she's been picked up, her friends have been picked up out on the street, have been taken to different parts of town late at night and been forced to perform sexual acts on law enforcement, on some of them who basically say to them, if you don't do this, I'm going to take you into jail, and I'm going to make sure that, you know, charges are filed against you. And, you know, I was blown away. You know, not that I'm naive to what can potentially happen to people out there on the street, right? Because I hear all kinds of crazy stories all day long from my clients. But never had I heard anything like that. You know, I'd only been in LA for a few months, and like I said, that this was a population that I hadn't really served up in Sacramento. So I begged her to go to trial. I said, look, let them earn this conviction. They maxed you out. Like, what's the harm in it? Let's go and tell your story, and let's expose this officer, right? And I got her actually kind of excited about that idea. And for a while, we, you know, talked about how that would look like. She would have to come every day to trial. You know, she would be involved in helping me pick a jury for her. And at the end of the day, she would have to testify. And her priors would come out against her, and she would be cross-examined, and she would know at the end of the day that she would go to jail. And, you know, soon after we discussed that for a while, I could tell that it wasn't going to happen. And she was like, look, at the end of the day, I'm the one that has to go back out into the neighborhood. I'm the one that has to go back home. I'm the one that has to see these cops on the street. They know my friends. I'm afraid. I'm afraid of what they'll do to me. I'm afraid of what they'll do to my community. And who am I to, how can I even really respond to that, right? Like, at that point, I'm like, okay, let's focus on the goal here. You don't want to go to jail. Let me see what I can do. In that courtroom, I happened to have a prosecutor who actually listens to me. And some of them don't. You know, I come sometimes with great progress reports from my clients or, you know, letters of recommendations, and some tell me not to even bother. But in this particular courtroom, I had a prosecutor who was actually really great, and he listened to me, and I told him, and I told him the story. I told him what my client had told me. I'm like, you know, and she's really considering going to trial because you guys are maxing her out anyways. And luckily, we got a community labor offer out of it. So they offered her probation with some days of community labor where she goes out and picks up trash and comes back to court and shows proof, and that's the end of it. So we were able to avoid jail with her. And so it was a positive outcome for her. And, you know,
Opportunity to be here. As Bianca mentioned, I am with the U.S. Department of Justice as an assistant United States attorney. So for some of the non-lawyers in the room, that means that I work with the more limited jurisdiction of the federal government on criminal prosecutions. So whereas maybe the LA County Sheriff's Department would take a case to the district attorney's office, the FBI takes a case to my office. That doesn't mean I can't work with LA County or local police departments, but that's kind of the difference between the two systems. So I'm like a district attorney, but on the federal side. And I had, since 2005, I focused on prosecutions involving child exploitation and human trafficking. And, I just wanted to convey, and sometimes I think this is misunderstood, that, law enforcement does not care about this issue. And unfortunately, it is a work in progress, educating detectives, educating parole officers. But I can tell you, having spent 2 years in DC and with the work I do in Orange County, that there are many, many people in law enforcement who care deeply about this issue and about the victims. In fact, it's part of Attorney General Holder's priority goal program. There's 4 priority goals across the nation, and this applies to all FBI offices, all U.S. attorneys' offices, and it's national security, gun violence, white-collar crime, and protecting vulnerable populations. And that includes child exploitation, human trafficking, elder justice, and American Indian, Alaska Native children exposed to violence. And so that's something that he cares deeply about. In fact, so deeply that I get to announce today, I knew about it for a few weeks, but he actually held a major event in Washington today on human trafficking. You can go to usdoj.gov, and his remarks are there. Given that Loretta Lynch is in her confirmation process, it'll actually probably be, if not the last, one of the last major speeches by Attorney General Holder on, we view this as a civil rights issue in the federal system. This comes down from the history of the federal government working to abolish slavery, segregation. It is that heritage that we view human trafficking, both as it exploits adults and children. So I just wanted to convey that. At the highest level, this is something that is a priority. What is the kind of federal definition of human trafficking? It's great that every state has its own human trafficking laws now. That's something that's more recent. As I said, a lot of this is an outgrowth of slavery, anti-slavery, and peonage prosecutions, but in 2000, as was mentioned this morning, there was the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and that gave specific, in Chapter 77 of Title 18, special statutes for human trafficking. So specifically regarding adult sex trafficking, if someone recruits, entices, harbors, transports, provides, obtains, or maintains by any means a person, second part, knowing or in reckless disregard of the facts, so they don't necessarily need to know for sure, that force, threats of force, fraud, coercion, or any combination of such means will be used to engage in a commercial sex act. So that is the federal definition. If it's a minor, which in the federal system is under the age of 18, no force, fraud, or coercion is required. And there's also another provision, which I'm going to get to in a second, which has become kind of a source of discussion, that if a defendant has a reasonable opportunity to observe the minor, and then they can also be held responsible. So if the child is not, looks 12 years old, if they pick up the child from a junior high, things that would be clues to the fact that they're under 18, even if the child doesn't say they're 18, even if the child, for example, says, I'm 19, but it's so clear that they're not because they were picked up at a junior high, they don't even, appear to be that age, we can prosecute in those cases. There was, I think, at one question, a question from the audience about demand side enforcement. I'm kind of giving all this as a background. I'm going to get to the victimization issue in a minute, but just some kind of general matters. And something that's also sometimes misunderstood is the fact that the federal law does cover Johns if they have the requisite knowledge, which means that they either knew or had this kind of reasonable opportunity to observe that they were having commercial sex with a minor, or they knew that adult was being subjected to force, fraud, or coercion. And this has actually been tried. It was in South Dakota. It's a case called Youngers and Bonestrew. In fact, the current U.S. Attorney for South Dakota, Brendan Johnson, who's a wonderful person, was the prosecutor on that case. And they said this person knew that the person they were engaging in commercial sex was under the age of 18. They're a John. They're still held to this federal statute. And that was a huge victory for us. There's currently legislation to try to make that even more clear in the law, so it's something that's kind of percolating in Congress right now, with a view towards strengthening demand side, John side enforcement. And I'm sorry if anyone's offended by the word John. I know that that's something that we're moving away from, but it's what's kind of commonly understood. And we also use, like I said, demand side enforcement. The other thing I wanted to kind of point out with the federal law was, what is coercion? And this is something we've also kind of been pushing the envelope on, and the Civil Rights Division is prosecuting cases where the coercion is drug dependency. And this is something that's really, I think, critical and important, because we are seeing cases and hearing stories where the women, men, boys, girls, transgender individuals are being given drugs by their pimp, say, for free, makes them drug dependent, and then that's the control their drug source. And so we've had convictions where that whole coercion has been the drug source angle, and the judges are really getting on board with that. This has been, an education for all of us, including the judiciary. And sometimes we bring these cases in, and they're looking at us like, why is this in federal court? Why is this a big deal? And explaining, how serious this is. And then the other thing is forced labor, which, in my humble opinion, does not always get as much attention as it deserves. Obviously, all of this is really important, but we in the federal system see forced labor in many, many different forms. There's regional issues from agriculture, hospitality, the garment industry, and we see things, the use of physical force, but we also see things like debt bondage, which is specifically prohibited under federal law, that you cannot hold somebody in debt bondage. The president issued an executive order regarding recruiting fees in the international procurement chain issues. So, like, the Department of Defense is the largest purchaser of goods in the world. And so, working to make sure that what it is that they're buying or the services they're getting, both domestically and at their bases overseas, are not the result of forced or child labor. And so that's something that I got to work on, and that is really important. And recruiting fees are a huge problem. We see people being recruited from Bangladesh to work in the Middle East, and I can go on for that for like an hour, but I won't have other things to talk about, but it's just something to think about. And as you're learning more about the issue, I really encourage you to read more about forced labor and some of the excellent research that's being done in that area. So I'm running out of time. I'm going to skip some things, but one thing, that there is no specific federal prostitution charge. That is something that's generally charged at the state, county, local level. But that doesn't, and we typically don't charge juveniles in the federal system, although in certain circumstances we can. But that doesn't mean that we don't deal with the issues of criminalization and victimization in human trafficking cases. And that is because these victim survivors are our witnesses. And this was kind of brought up in the last panel. And it's something that we deal with, and that our purpose in the federal law enforcement system is twofold. And the Attorney General has victim witness assistance guidance. Every prosecutor is given this handy book, and we have annual training on it. And from the first lines of Attorney General, this was revised in 2011, Attorney General Holder's letter was, our core mission is to pursue justice for criminal acts, and that pursuit includes justice for the victims of and witnesses to crime. And so we have this dual mission, and that sometimes, frankly, complicates things, because we are tasked with pursuing, prosecuting, bringing justice for the offenders, in this case the traffickers, but we also need to respect and help the victim survivors. And finding that balance can be very challenging. And sometimes people don't agree with the way that we do it. You know, what is encouraging versus what is pushing. I had a fraud case. It was right after Richard Reed, the shoe bomber, the guy who tried to light his shoe on fire. And she was, white collar fraud case, this woman, she was the only charged counts we had. So this victim needed to come out and testify about how she was defrauded by the defendant. She was terrified to fly, had never been away from her children, but she, literally, if she did not come from Florida to testify in California, this guy who had engaged in a $3 million scheme where he had defrauded all these people was going to get away with it because she had kept the envelopes from the mailings, and we needed that to prove the date of the mailings for mail fraud. Seems ridiculous that we have to rely on this one person, but this is just the way sometimes it works. And so, you know, the FBI agent and I get on the phone with her, and we're just like, you know, please, we know how hard this is, we know how scary this is, but it's important. It's important for you. We really feel that you're going to get closure from this. It's important for the other victims who, because they didn't keep the paperwork, and she's like, I'm being punished for being organized. And I was like, well, I don't necessarily disagree with you, but, you know, trying to get her on that plane. And she did, and she came, and she was away from her children, and it was hard, and it was scary, and afterwards she's like, I'm glad I did this, thank you. But, you know, it was that line of how hard do we push to get her on this plane? We knew she didn't want to do it, but it was important. And I used this fraud example to try to, you know, show it in a different context. And obviously what her, you know, the victimization that she had gone through financially is not the same as physical sexual trauma. I recognize that. But it is this balance, and it's just something, you know, to think about. I mean, we try to break this cycle of control and trafficking, and, you know, we have you know, a growing amount of victim service providers, both within the government community, NGOs, faith-based organizations. I was talking to, I think, Angeles and Meredith last night about, you know, the number one thing is secure housing. Like, secure housing is such a challenge for victims, and I say secure. You know, the traffickers, we've had situations, there was a situation up in Maryland where a trafficker came back, knew where the person was staying, poured gasoline on the front door and lit it on fire. Luckily, the people survived. But you can't just, and as law enforcement, we have a responsibility to make sure that there is secure placement. And unfortunately, in some situations, and it's not the first option that we want to have, that secure housing can be custody. And that is, I know it's probably not a popular thing to say, but that's the reality sometimes. And we're hoping that that is going to become less and less, and that custody is becoming less and less of an option. That's a last resort, but sometimes, another example, we had a young woman, the victim service provider thought she could be reunited with her mother. That did not go well because she had ended up on the street because of disagreements with her mother. She jumped out of a car on the 405 freeway. A moving car on the 405 freeway. She survived. She was, a state judge put a 5150 psych hold on her for 72 hours, and then we, you know, worked on getting placement for her. Obviously, that is not what we wanted to have happen, but at that point, we felt that she was a danger to herself, and she was in such a crisis stage that was something. So that's something that's also, you know, sometimes misunderstood, and there's disagreement. I mean, I recognize that. I recognize people will disagree with that tactic, but we're doing the best we can, and from everything that I've seen both at the local and national level, it's not out of malice, or I've never seen that happen. Not to say that it hasn't or won't somewhere, that people get some kind of joy out of doing this. You know, it's a really complicated issue, and so one also thing I wanted to mention that sometimes has kind of misconstrued is we have an option in the federal system of designating a victim survivor as what we call material witness. Has anyone heard of this? Raise hands. Anyone? Maybe. It can happen in any kind of case. It happens actually most often in undocumented immigrant smuggling cases where people don't have legal status, and so they're brought before the court. They are subject to court supervision as an essential witness to the case. It can also happen in terrorism cases, and it can provide them certain benefits, but they are subject to court supervision. So that's something that has been an option in federal human trafficking cases. Sometimes there's been an ankle monitor placed on the victim survivor. Obviously, that's not, once again, first option. But especially with these young women, they run. And it's the reality of, once again, balancing, our duty to try to do the best that we can to prosecute the offender, keep her safe, and not re-victimize her. And, I think there's good dialogue going on this issue, but that's something that can happen. But it can also be a really positive, I don't know, we've heard from survivors that it's been a positive experience. I'm sure not all of them would agree with us on this, but that they are appointed counsel through this process, and our local federal public defender has actually wants to represent the victim survivors and not the defendants. So they have an attorney who acts more like a guardian ad litem for them in the court proceedings. They have built a relationship with a magistrate judge. They're not criminally charged, who basically checks in with them and says, you know what, when you're subpoenaed for court, you have to show up. And is that kind of voice, and our magistrates are excellent at this. Obviously, this is all kind of personnel driven and people being informed on the process. So it's just something that breaking that bond with the pimp trafficker, we're trying to learn more from domestic violence programs. That's something that we really feel like they've learned a lot over the last 15, 20 years. That is similar, it's not the same, but we can learn from them that emotional bond. I think some people in the last panel talked about it. They care. They think they care for them. They think they love them. The whole Romeo pimp concept. This is the person who, in my life, they think has shown unconditional love, and to show them that they can trust other people. Also, it was mentioned they could very well have children with their trafficker. I mean, that the trafficker is their father. And then you have family court issues and trying to, say they think because maybe if they didn't have a father figure growing up, that the pimp's better father than nothing. And so trying to navigate all of that. Then I said the drug dependent issue is huge. And it's something that I wish that there were more programs specifically geared towards drug dependency and human trafficking combined. And so that's something we worked on in Washington. And, I just also wrap up here. But, building that trust with the challenge of, once again, this is just reality, they are still a witness. So we have to maintain some boundaries. And that's why partnering with great victim service organizations is key for us, because, like I said, we have this dual role. We have to disclose any benefits we give them to the defense. That's our legal obligation as Brady Jenks discovery material. And so, if we buy them lunch, we have to disclose that. Not mean to say I'm not going to buy them lunch, but I had a human trafficking international, foreign national. She was a Taiwanese college student who was promised a job doing bottle service at a really high-end LA club. And she came, LAX, they took her passport, they took her down to Costa Mesa and forced her into commercial sex work. It was a horrible situation, but the Costa Mesa Police Department recovered her within a few days. And she kept on asking us, she wanted to go to Disneyland and Las Vegas. It was like we wanted to do things for her, but we're like, I don't know, like pre-trial, this is not really appropriate, especially as a government, we can't do this. And even I knew I had friends who worked at Disneyland, I could call in a favor, but I was like, this just doesn't really feel right, and I'd have to disclose it to the defense, and then if you disclose it to the defense and it goes to trial, then she's gonna get cross-examined, and you said this because the prosecutor gave you tickets to Disneyland, and you're like, but this is what she wants. And then I thought, I said, we can talk about this after the case is over, and, but I ended up finding out, this broke my heart, that the reason she wanted to go to these places was to take pictures so that when she went back to Taiwan, she could show her parents, because she was so ashamed that she wanted to show that she had just a Southern California vacation, because it had been so horrible, she had no pictures to show them. So, we were able to work with victim service providers and, make some of those arrangements for her. But as a government official in the criminal justice system, I sometimes can't do everything that I want to do. And some of the FBI agents, we had a male FBI agent, he's very good at his job, but once again, I threw this out there, and this is no fault of the victim survivors at all, that they have survived through their sexuality, they've survived through the survival, manipulating situations, and so sometimes our male and female agents have to take a step back. They can't take they pick up the phone, but, there is a balance there. And I say this because I want to sometimes explain things that law enforcement may do that may be perceived as not being as receptive. There may be more to the story that's not immediately apparent. It may be that they're not properly trained and they're not doing their job appropriately either. But I just wanted to throw that out there. So I think I've actually gone way over, but I will be happy to answer questions later on, but I'll turn it over to Meredith.
I'm a researcher, so I use a PowerPoint as a crutch. So give me 1 second. And they're going to move, so you don't have to look at their heads the entire time. So I should also say that I am not a lawyer. Presenting findings of a study that has not come out yet. It's coming out at the end of February. So it's kind of exciting, and it's going to kind of change the conversation a little bit as well, because a lot of the conversations, at least the ones that I've been in, have focused on girls and young women. And in a study I worked on in 2008, that was through the National Institute of Justice while I was at John Jay College. We interviewed over 300 young people about their experiences in being commercially sexually exploited. And what I found with that study was that the way that the predominant narrative out there is often, stated in the media and things of that sort is very different. And that this is a very complicated, very nuanced issue. And that there are boys that are involved in this. There are trans youth, both trans boys and trans girls that are involved in this. And their voices are oftentimes not heard. So based on my experiences working on that study, after I finished my PhD, I made it my primary goal to get funding to look specifically at the experiences of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and questioning youth. In addition to young men who have sex with men and young women who have sex with women. So that under that category, those are young people who identify as straight but have sex with members of the same sex, often exchange for money, food, shelter, drugs, and things of that sort. The first slide that I'm going to present is the terminology slide and why we chose to use the certain terms that we did. And I know Beth had mentioned in the previous session and possibly other sessions the use of terminology, and it can be very loaded, and people, use terminology based on their experiences or what they've heard. And we felt it was really important to use terminology that the young people felt comfortable using, that the way that they explained and described their experiences. So the terminology that we'll be using is based on those interviews, and I'll describe a little bit about the methodology there. I should also say that for this particular study, we partnered with an organization, a youth leadership organization based in New York City, called Streetwise and Safe. And they take young LGBTQ youth of color, and they train them on Know Your Rights trainings and things of that sort. And they go out in the community, and it's very peer-led. So I felt it was really important for this study to take young people and the people that we're hoping to target, to sample, could identify with. And those were young LGBTQ youth who either had firsthand experiences engaging in survival sex or being commercially sexually exploited, or had a large peer network who experienced those things. So youth engaged in survival sex is the umbrella term that we use, and there are many things that fall underneath that. But this is something that a lot of the young people, how they explain their situations. It's also a behavior that we're describing. It's not a label that we are assigning to them as victim or as trafficked youth or things of that sort. So we wanted to make sure that we're using the words that they used. We use the term exploiter as an individual who uses tactics involving force, fraud, and coercion to control a young person's involvement in the commercial sex market. Other people would use the word trafficker or pimp. For the purposes of this research, we use the term exploiter. And then the complicated term peer facilitator. Now this is a young person, a peer, who may or may not be engaged in survival sex themselves, who provides non-exploitative support. They're not looking, there's no force, fraud, or coercion involved. They're not looking for anything in return. Oftentimes it's a young person who's engaging in survival sex themselves, who sees another young person who is in need, who needs their basic needs met. And through this relationship, they assist them in being able to provide that, because that's what they have done for survival, and they're just trying to help one another out. So that is the terms that we use for this. And I we'll learn how to use this. Okay, so the methodology. We use a method called respondent-driven sampling, which has been used in several studies. It's the methodology we used in 2008 study that I worked on as well. And it's essentially snowball sampling. And the way that it works is we find seeds, so young people who are the brave souls who will come forward first and take the risk of being interviewed. And usually we work through service providers in the community or other individuals that we know of. And for this particular study, because we were working with young people, we relied on them to also suggest or recruit their own peers. And we ended up interviewing 283 young people. Our goal was 300, and we got very close to that. And one of the reasons, or one of the main reasons why we'll be able to do that is because the way that this methodology works is it's anonymous and it's confidential. We do not take any identifying information from them. And so, even the fear was that they'd come in and we'd call law enforcement, we'd call CPS. We don't have that information to even be able to do that. And so once word got out, and within this population, those peer networks are super strong. So once those brave souls came in and found out that we weren't calling CPS or we weren't calling law enforcement, things worked really quick. The snowball started picking up really quickly. And we asked them questions. The report that will be released at the end of February, we decided to break it up into chunks this time because I'm sick of answering questions as to why all my reports are over 300 pages. So we decided to do it in, 70 pages here, 70 pages there. So the first report that will be out will be more of an overview, which goes over the youth characteristics, their demographics, method of entry into the commercial sex market and what their involvement looks like, what their networks look like. And then we do touch upon a little bit about health and legal consequences, access to services, their needs, their interactions with law enforcement, and court processing and sentencing. But those last 4 bullets are going to be talked more about in depth in future publications. I will, for the purposes of this panel, give you even more of a preview and talk a little bit about their experiences interacting with law enforcement and my interviews with the NYPD. So our findings. So I'm going to go over some of the demographics of the young people that we interviewed, and the first is gender. So half of the sample identified as male, so about 46%, 35% identified as female, 11% identified as trans female, 3% as trans male, 2% as trans other, and then 3% as other, which included queer, questioning, androgynous, femme, gender nonconforming. They could identify however they wanted. We did not have closed-ended categories for both gender or sexual orientation, so that's why the responses varied greatly. But I will say this is the first study, to get such a large transgender sample, but absolutely the first study ever to document the experiences of trans boys. It's really not heard of in their experiences engaging in survival sex. So with sexual orientation, 40% identified as gay or lesbian, 14% identified as straight. Again, we would categorize them under the young men who have sex with men, YMSM, or young women who have sex with women. So those, even though identified as straight, part of the criteria was that they were having sex with members of the same sex. 36% identified as bisexual, and then we had 11%, again, identify as other. That can include categories as open, pansexual, no preference, no label. These got cut off a little bit, and I apologize because I don't remember what was there. And then with race, as you can see, predominantly young people of color. Only 5% identified as white. So, this was a little bit different than the study that I conducted in 2008, where a quarter of the young people identified as white. I don't have any justification or understanding or reasons why almost the entire sample was a young person or included young people of color. But I think it is very telling about, who this population is. Birthplace. You often, it's New York City. You think everybody's coming from every other state because this is an accepting place to be if you are LGBTQ, or in their services galore and you can get all your needs met. Actually, 6 in 10 youth were actually born in New York, born and raised in New York. They were kicked out of their homes because of their sexual orientation or thrown out of their homes because of their gender identity. There was a lot of family rejection happening, and they really had no place to go. That wasn't all of them, and I'll talk a little bit about their living situations in a couple of slides. But a lot of them were homeless in their hometown. They did not have the support network that other young people have, where if they were in a situation, they could go to somebody for help. And many of them were actually living in emergency shelters or even on the streets, on the subway, and couch surfing. I think homeless for young people looks very different than homeless for adults, and there's a lot of couch surfing that happens, bouncing from place to place to place. And there was also talks of, living with what they called their clients, and oftentimes their regular clients for periods of time. And so there's just constant movement, and that has a lot to do with instability. 2 in 10 were born in other eastern U.S. states, so Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts. And then 1 in 10 were born outside of the U.S., and that was predominantly in the West Indies or in the Caribbean. Education. We've heard a lot today about education and the barriers to, or due to instability in their lives, their inability or their just disinterest in staying in school, just because there's so much chaos in their lives otherwise. So 76% were not currently enrolled in school at the time of the interview, although almost half had neither graduated high school nor obtained a GED, even though they were over the age, or 18 or over. Of those currently who said that they were enrolled in school, 39% reported not having attended class in the year before that interview. And this is the living situation I was talking about. So half the youth we interviewed, 48% reported living in a shelter, or something that looked like a shelter. Another 10% transitional living. Another 10% said they lived on the street. In addition, 1 in 10 youth said they lived in a family home. So these are not all homeless youth. Some of them do still have an intact family, and their experiences looked a little different. Many of them were engaging in this to be able to contribute to rent, to contribute to the bills, to help their siblings out, and things of that sort. 10% lived in a friend's home, and then 9% had their own place or apartment, oftentimes through public housing, and or in some cases, some of them had saved enough money where they were able to put down the down payment on an apartment. So as far as, I will say, at the time of the interview, the majority of young people were between the ages of 18 to 21. We went up to the age of 21 because, as many of you probably know, their first age of engaging in this tends to be younger. So we wanted to be able to document kind of the historical their historical experiences, which are oftentimes not documented. So we did have, a handful of young people who were under the age of 10 who first engaged in this, but predominantly, the average age was 17, and most youth were between the 15 to 18, around 17 or 18. If you are in the foster care system or in child welfare, you start losing services and start aging out. You start worrying about, oh my God, how am I going to get my next meal? Where am I going to stay? Where I don't have a support network. And so this is where some of this starts happening. Or if you're in the youth shelter, at least in New York City, and I know it changes by state, you can't, the minimum age to be in a youth shelter is 16, and it goes some cases up to 24 and some others 21. This is where they meet these other peers and they learn, okay, this is what I need to do to be able to survive and feed myself and things of that sort. How they first engaged, 42% had a friend or peer, and this could be a peer facilitator, or this could be somebody that they identified as a friend or a peer who might have been, working with a trafficker or an exploiter and were recruited through that person. But since they first identified that person as a friend or a peer, that's how this was coded. 6% were initially engaged or recruited through an exploiter, and I'll get to that a little bit about how that looks like and why, you can't always take for how they first enter as their permanent experience, and things change over time. 24% somebody approached them, 18% own initiative, and many times that looked like, again, I need to eat, I need somewhere to stay, I need a hotel room for the night. For many of the trans boys and girls, getting access to hormones, getting access to gender-affirming clothing and things of that sort, they needed money to be able to do that because they weren't able to go into a shelter and get those things. And then this 3% given something that was not for free. It was, they were told, you can stay in my apartment, or hey, here's a, PlayStation. And they thought that that was something that was going to be given to them as a gift, but it turns out that there were these strings attached. So now I'm going to get into some of the quotes, and where I could, and I didn't get a chance to go back to extend some of the more of who these young people were. So you don't have the full picture, but this was a young black gay male. I don't remember it that vividly. All I know is just that I was starving. My friend was like, come to the stroll with me, trust me, you'll get somebody. I was hungry, I was cold, so I did it. The stories of starvation was shocking to me, and I've been researching this for almost 10 years. The number of young people who had come to get interviewed who had not eaten in the last 24 to 48 hours, and again, this is New York City, was overwhelming. I mean, we always made sure to have snacks and things like that handy for them, and we ordered pizzas, we had all of that stuff. But again, this was only one point in time that they can get. You give them the money and you give them referrals, information, and then again, and I'll talk a little bit about their needs in a little bit. But again, this was something that we heard often. This was an 18-year-old black female. He came up to me. He was like, hey, how are you doing? You're kind of beautiful. I was like, thank you. And he asked me for my number, so I gave him my number. Met up with him. I didn't know he was a pimp, but I found out, but whatever. And I was like, hey, I need the money, so I got to do what I got to do to survive out here, because it's not easy on the streets. So I had to do what I do. I needed the money. So again, this goes into, this idea where they're force, fraud, and coercion. And this, I think, is interesting because this, again, has to do with survival. This young woman didn't have the money to be able to eat, the money to put a roof over her head. And so that was her initial justification or understanding of getting involved in this. This white 21-year-old, she identified as transsexual. I didn't really think about it, trading sex for anything when I first moved here. So she was not born and raised in New York. And then whenever I got here, I realized it was just so popular because there were so many people in my situation that were unemployed and they needed money, and that it was just so easy to get into. So I was a very conservative person. I didn't really think about doing that, but times got really, really hard, and I didn't eat for about a week. And I didn't have anywhere to stay. I was sneaking on the train, and so I decided I was going to clean myself up a little bit, decided to go out there and do what I had to do. And this was a 20-year-old black male, heterosexual. It came to the point where my mother had kicked me out of the house and I was staying with him. And this was somebody who was providing money and shelter and things of that sort. So pretty much he was paying for everything for me, so I really didn't have a choice. I didn't know how to handle it because he was still basically giving my financial needs. So I couldn't say no. He just came like, I know you need to take care of your girlfriend and stuff like that. And I couldn't say no because at the time she was pregnant. I figured I'm sacrificing myself, my body for somebody else. I felt like I'm doing a good thing. So what do you receive in exchange for a sexual act? This is not mutually exclusive. They could have picked any of these categories. Money, overwhelmingly 88%, but that could be as little as $5. Could be as little as $2.50 to get on the subway. It could go up to several $100s. It really depended on the situation. Oftentimes, and then shelter, 29%, 19% food, and as you can see, these other categories. You heard a lot more about trading for shelter, particularly when it's cold out. And we've had some really harsh winters in New York the last couple of years. So, there was definitely probably a spike in that. Now, situations involving an exploiter. I will say that the way anyone under the age of 18 who's engaging in commercial sex act is technically a victim of human trafficking. However, how it plays out in court and arrest and things of that sort, in practice it looks slightly different. And what HHS is doing, at least, and it might be government-wide, is kind of categorizing the simple forms of human trafficking and severe forms of human trafficking. So simple wouldn't involve a trafficker or an exploiter, whereas severe would. So in this way, 14.5% of the young people we interviewed did have somebody, an exploiter, where there was evidence of force, fraud, and coercion. And some of those narratives included 20-year-old black female. Every time I would think of running and thinking about going to the cops, he would say, if you go to the cops, I will kill you and stuff like that. So it was like, I didn't have anybody to run to. I couldn't go back home or anything. He would just keep me confined in a house unless I had to go do something. We go shopping or something, he would be right there, and if he's not with me, he has somebody watching me. and this is a 17-year-old black female. I'm with some other girl, and we go to use the bathroom somewhere, and a guy comes. It was like a setup. He's like, you know you're mine. I'm like, no, not. I've got to go. And he was like, you know you have to do what I say. You can't leave until you make me a certain amount of money. He beat me all types of stuff and locked me in a room. So I'm in a room for 3 days, and then he's like, okay, you know what you have to do. You have to make me a certain amount of money, and then you can leave. I was gone like the wind as soon as I got out of there. Now, granted, these are 2 quotes from 2 young females. However, again, challenging the typical narrative, we did hear from trans girls and boys who had an exploiter at some point in their experience, and their situations looked very similar to this. There was abuse, there was emotional coercion, there was psychological coercion. So again, this is not something that only affects young females. Other findings, there's tons of findings. I just kind of picked things here and there, but hopefully you'll all be reading the report at the end of February. How do you find customers? 59% posted ads online, 48% work the street. How do you protect yourself? 33% carried a knife or blade with them, 20% carried mace. 19% had no protection with them and either would just take the assault and then deal with it later or would run. And 13% said they would use their fists. Now, do you want to stop engaging in survival sex? Overwhelmingly, 78% said yes. 15% had already stopped, and many times because they were able to find stable living situations or a stable partner, some stability in their lives. 7% said no. Oftentimes that looked like young people who might have had regular clientele and felt comfortable with them, and this was a steady source of income, and they weren't in a place in their life where they felt like they would be able to get that income elsewhere. So I think this was probably one of the most powerful quotes, and this was a 19-year-old Latino male who was actually the first interview we did. And his story was him and his trans sister were abandoned by their mother when they were 15. She went back to Puerto Rico but wanted to keep the government housing that they had, so she left them behind to take care of themselves and didn't leave them any kind of support to be able to do so. And so a cousin of his or a distant cousin of his was like, hey, I see people in the neighborhood doing this. Maybe this is something you want to do. You'll be able to provide for you. You'll be able to provide for your sister. And so there are many positive, we asked him about positives. Is there anything positive about trading? There are many positive things about trading sex. You can trade sex for the life of your kids. You can trade sex to keep your apartment. You can trade sex to feed yourself. Some people think that the sex trade is the worst thing to do because you're selling yourself. When it boils down to it, if you have food in your stomach, you have no transportation, but you have a man in your face willing to give you money for a half hour, you put your pride to the side, you throw everything out the window, and you forget who you are, and you forget what you're doing, you learn to be someone else. So our main findings, and I know I'm kind of running out of time. Youth reported experience of social and familial discrimination and rejection, familial dysfunction, familial poverty, physical abuse, sexual abuse, exploitation, and emotional mental trauma. These were a lot of the drivers of what was pushing these young people into this. The experiences of youth engaged in survivor sex are not static, and this is a point that I like to stress over and over again. So a young person might first have their first experience through an exploiter, through a trafficker. That doesn't mean that they're going to be with that trafficker or even another trafficker through their entire experience of engaging in this. They might start, quote, working independently for themselves in order to have their basic needs met, and vice versa. You might start off with your peer network and then get recruited by a pimp or a trafficker or an exploiter at some point. So it's really important, that's why it's really important when you're working with these young people, in whatever capacity you're working with them, is to get the whole narrative about their experiences to be able to really understand what they've been through. LGBT youth tend to have a large peer networks, which include youth engaged in sex. And again, this goes into the peer networks and peer facilitator concept. These youth lack access to voluntary and low-threshold services, including short and long-term housing, affordable housing and shelter options, livable wage employment opportunities, food security, and gender-affirming health care. Many youth engaged in survival sex experience frequent arrests for a variety of quality of life. I'll talk about that in a couple of slides. And misdemeanor crimes, creating further instability and perpetuating the need to engage in survival sex. The idea of the revolving door: if I have a record, I can't get housing. If I have a record, I can't get access to a lot of benefits. Youth experience violence and abuse from multiple sources, including families, exploiters, clients, strangers, peers, law enforcement, even service providers, both staff and the residents of the shelters that they're staying in. But I think this finding, or this point, is really important, that youth are extremely resilient in the face of external challenges, of all these challenges, and internal challenges. They find ways to survive, often relying on their informal networks, street savvy, and quick learning abilities to share resources and skills and to adapt to difficult and often dangerous situations. So just quickly, the criminal justice involvement, number of arrests. So this is kind of where the criminal justice victimization happens. 0% never been arrested. I mean, 29% had never been arrested. But as you can see, 25% had at least arrested once, 11% 2 times, all the way up to 9% had been arrested 11 or more. Arrest charges. Only 4.9% had been arrested on prostitution-related charges. So many of them had been arrested on assault, drug possession, to be honest, off the top of my head, I can't remember what the other, but it was things here and there. But jumping the turnstile, which I know is very a New York thing, but I'm sure in other places, anytime you do not pay, it's a theft of services. And many of these young people just don't have the $2.50 to be able to pay for the subway. And I've seen cops come out of, feel like the ceiling the minute someone goes underneath a turnstile. It's been mind-blowing how quickly they act on it. And they can't pay the fine, they don't go to the court, so a warrant is out for their arrest. And so this, again, is where that cycle continues to happen. And then my interviews with the NYPD are always enlightening, but for this particular topic, the officers that I interviewed, and let me tell you, trying to get interviews with the NYPD is not even remotely easy. So, and I'm sure they'll be really happy to see these findings. In their opinion, youth are mostly Black or Hispanic from the Bronx, Brooklyn, or New Jersey. Youth come from the ghetto neighborhoods and are looking for acceptance. There is some drug use, primarily marijuana, which we did find that, the drugs that are used is primarily marijuana, that hard drugs are not actually really used, or these young people are not using hard drugs. Mental health uses are just as prevalent in this population or in the general population, so it's not that these young people are suffering from every mental illness, again, which is something we found as well. But the non-prostitution related crimes, so hustles start with prostitution. If they don't make money doing that, they result to assault and robbery. Again, this is in the opinions of the NYPD. They don't see people who do sex work to survive as criminals. However, youth, ages 13, 14, and 15, are acting with harder older youth, those 17-year-olds, who are turning the younger youth into criminals. The LGBTQ youth, they are often involved in robberies, simple assaults, or more serious crimes related to hustling customers or potential customers. They will at restaurants sometimes, but for the 17 and older population, they're already committing more crimes, so they'll get more bang for their buck in crime reduction if they arrest the youth committing the crimes as opposed to the Johns. One story that we heard was there was an older, rich gentleman in the neighborhood would go out to the stroll and pick himself out a young boy here and there, and he'd gotten robbed twice, and actually called the police and told them that. And the NYPD was like, well, who the victim here is the man. He got robbed twice. It wasn't the fact that he was going out and taking minors back to his home. And then lastly, which still these comments startle me. There's very little trafficking involved when it comes to LGBTQ youth, so they can't use any of the trafficking resources to assist them. Fantasy world that the LGBTQ youth are living in with their gay families, which is actually oftentimes their only support in their lives because their actual families have kicked them out. And it's difficult to break these bonds with their gay families, and the gay family model sets up our grand larceny program. This gay family model is also promoted by the service providers. So again, this is where the breakdown happens, and this is where a lot of the young people then get arrested and go through the criminal justice system. I am going to stop. I do have recommendations, but maybe in conversations or afterwards we can talk about it. Probably a lot of them is about housing and creating a safe and supportive living situations. One thing I just want to point out about that is I think when you think of these girls in particular, you think of cisgender, heterosexual girls. But actually a lot of the girls, I wouldn't say a lot because I don't know the number, some girls who work with or for exploiter or are being trafficked identify as bisexual or lesbian. And this is why programming that is specifically for the girls who've been trafficked is important for them to feel safe and open to be able to talk about their sexuality and their gender identity and things of that sort, which is something that's often not talked about. So that is what I'll cover. Oops, sorry. Messed that all up. You just did the
Yeah, I just had.
She thought of two things.
Yes, two things I forgot to say. I'm sorry, I kind of want to build on what Meredith said. So, in terms of the peer facilitator recruiter issue, that's something that is on my top of my list to mention, and that's one really huge challenge in the criminal justice system. You have, it tends to be women who were victimized at some point and may still be under the control of their trafficker pimp, and then they start recruiting younger girls, and they're known and sometimes as bottoms. If you've heard that term before, And it's something in the criminal justice system that's really challenging to deal with because they were victimized at one point, but now they have turned to offending under the law. And so are they criminally culpable? How should they be treated? Should they be prosecuted but have sentencing mitigation? There is limited duress defense for the law students out there. If they don't have an absolute duress defense, which means that they were truly forced to do it, they're not criminally culpable. But if it's something short of that, limited duress, that can be a reduced sentence. Obviously, it's a case-by-case situation, but I put it out there because it's something that is very complex, because it sometimes can get very egregious in some of the cases we see where these recruiters, these bottoms, are physically beating the younger girls or supplying drugs to the girls. And there's some prosecutors that feel that they should not be prosecuted at all, that they should get a pass based on their prior victimization. And there's some prosecutors who feel that they should be prosecuted because at some point they do become responsible unless, as I said, they have this complete duress, which means they truly were in fear of their physical safety, and then they wouldn't be.
And just to clarify, we're not, that is different from the peer facilitator that we defined,
okay.
yes. So
That's more of the recruiter area? Okay.
I'm going to ask that Bianca be given a chance to do the discussion, and then if we have additional questions or comments from the speakers, you can do it, so.
Great, thank you, Chris.
Bianca.
And I apologize, my hope is that folks might have a little time post the 4:45 endpoint to kind of keep having conversation. I unfortunately have a pretty hard leave time for childcare reasons, so I've truncated, I think the main comments that I'll make or the main questions that I have, but this slide, my social science research crutch, is literally just going to be, a list of the questions. So I will just kind of talk, and then those could be there in case you guys want to use them for some of the conversation. So again, I'm really honored to be here, to have asked to participate with this panel, particularly given that even though my area of work in the last 15 years has been in the area of gay and bisexual and lesbian youth sexual health work, youth in foster care, LGBTQ youth in foster care, and LGBT youth who are unstably housed or homelessness. Those as my primary areas. As you can imagine, the issue of sex trafficking comes up, but it has not been central to my own work. So also kind of similar to Angeles, when I was asked to be on the panel, I was kind of like, I don't know why you'd want me to do that. And then so similar, that there was kind of a sign that I was asked to present a recent study documenting the experiences of LGBTQ youth in foster care to like a national network of providers. And one of the requests was I had to comment on the recently passed sex trafficking and Prevention of Sex Trafficking and Families Act. So that seemed like a sign, okay, I need to kind of get on board and get that these are connected. So again, I offer these comments as a an outsider, not as an excuse for my ignorance, but also as kind of a framework if you want to push back on the way the questions are worded or thought about. So before getting to a few questions that I have, just some at least themes that I saw in the work, or just want to kind of thank the panelists for doing several things for us. Introducing core definitions of the terms and the specific populations that we're talking about implicitly or explicitly when we use really broad terms like sex trafficking. And collectively, the panelists have proposed key theoretical frameworks distinguishing engaging in force versus voluntary survival sex, and along the dimension, and considering the continuum of age in that context, which then have implications for the types of services and interventions needed. They've raised important questions about the foundational notion that our society criminalizes those engaging in survival sex, whether forced or unforced. Highlighted problems with law enforcement interactions with victims of trafficking and those engaged in survival sex, and I think really eloquently served as a proxy today for the voices of those who are victims, and also noted particularly vulnerable populations, and I think also highlighted the significance of understanding this issue from multiple perspectives here as researchers on the side of prosecution as well as the defense. So for the remainder of my time, I'm really just going to pose a few questions that struck me when thinking about the presentations overall. And like I said, you could take them up, the ones that you find interesting or not, or they can just become part of the overall discussion. So one is, I'd like the panel to consider their work in the context, actually, of the recent Preventing Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families Act. And Title I of this law amends actually the foster care and adoption assistance programs with new, for those who are not familiar with this, with new requirements for older children and foster care and for victims of sex trafficking. A lot of the great parts of this particular act has to do with better documentation of where foster youth go when AWOL and that connection to sex trafficking. But among the many new mandates, Title I of the Act requires states to develop and implement policies, procedures, and training for identifying, documenting, and determining appropriate services for children and youth who are at risk of sex trafficking. And so what I want to kind of zero in on there is that it's been noted by service providers and others working with victims of sex trafficking that this language of at risk is very vague. Essentially, who is at risk? So I'd like to hear, whether the audience or the panelists, the panel talk about who they think about as especially at risk and the extent to which this is an individual level or structural definition of risk and its implications for our sites of intervention and how we address the issue. So very much connected to that, many of the challenges raised by the panelists indicate that a consistent barrier to meeting the physical, mental, and social health needs of victims of sex trafficking and youth and young adults engaged in survival sex is that they are first and foremost treated like criminals themselves. So given this, it raises for me, and I know for many others, it was kind of implicitly noted, it's not clear whether the fundamental site of intervention here needs to be addressed. The one that needs to be addressed is actually a cultural one regarding attitudes about sexual practice and sex work. Or is this primarily about the need for legal intervention as the site of change with regard to treatment of people who are both perpetrators and criminals? Or is it really just something else or a combination of both? So I'd love to hear the panelists talk about that. And then several studies have, several of your work, or several studies generally have pointed to LGBT youth as disproportionately represented among those that are victims of sex trafficking. And Meredith's work, while not a population-based study, highlights how significant the subpopulation was within the kind of community of youth engaged in survival sex and who have experienced or are victims of sex trafficking. And so folks who have documented this kind of higher disproportionality have indicated that this may be a function of LGBT youth's already higher likelihood of being in the foster care system, as well as among youth who are experiencing homelessness or unstable housing. Like those are kind of mechanisms toward higher disproportionate representation among those who've been victims of trafficking. So one thing that we found in a study of foster youth here in LA who were LGBT youth were actually definitely overrepresented at a rate of 19% among youth in foster care. So that's about a fifth. And keep in mind that in the general population in the U.S., LGBT youth make up anywhere between 5 and 8%. But in the foster care system, about 19%, close to 20%. Is that most of the LGBT youth we are talking about are also primarily Black and Latino. And this seems similar to the youth that we're talking about here. So I would like the panel to kind of spell out more for us how they think about the ways that race and sexuality and gender identity and expression are intersecting to affect not just vulnerabilities participating in survival sex or being victims of sex trafficking, but also specific to the type of experiences that these youth have in navigating law enforcement in the courts. So kind of getting at that particular intersection around race and sexuality and gender. I will skip one of the questions, maybe just one more to highlight. Something I really loved about the strength of this panel was the combination of both legal practice and social science research. And another thing to consider is, what is this kind of ongoing relationship between empirical work and legal practice? And, what is the role of studies like Meredith's in informing, like creating an empirically informed kind of intervention, whether legal or social service, for those of you in the social services, and vice versa. You know, what's the role of, or what are some of the challenges for creating social science research that is grounded in the realities of social service practice and legal practice. So, you know, kind of a two-way street. So I'm actually going to leave it there and not even worry about the PowerPoint. Hopefully you kept track of maybe some of the questions, whatever struck you. I'll leave in 10 minutes, but you guys can keep talking. And I know Chris is going to...
What the panelists have to
Great.
say. I did want to ask also, one of the points about Meredith's study was that the folks who are being arrested are primarily being arrested for related crimes, not for prostitution.
Right.
And that, since we've, several times during this conference, I've heard this about, prostitution being criminalized, or people being criminalized for prostitution. And what we're seeing is that's a little more complicated too. That this is not just prostitution that's leading to the criminalization and the arrest. But I think that Bianca's raised some very interesting questions for the panelists, and maybe you could spend a couple minutes responding to one or more of those questions. We could probably have another whole panel on each one of them.
Yeah, those are some big questions. I'll try to just touch on a couple of them quickly. One about, you're absolutely right about the other types of criminal behavior, and I think Meredith can respond to that. And that it definitely raises the complexity of the issue, and especially drug charges, the theft charges, can be very difficult to kind of navigate in terms of one thing that I meant to mention was there's currently a debate in Congress between Senator Klobuchar from Minnesota, who is advocating a safe harbor bill, which would reduce federal funding for state and local law enforcement unless the state legislature passes a safe harbor law, which would prohibit charging minors with prostitution-related offenses. And then Senator Cornyn from Texas is advocating a collaborative courts approach, which would mean charging them and putting them in a diversion area. They're both interesting ideas. The Department of Justice is not currently taking a position on one or the other. They have pluses, minuses. Safe harbor, there's no safety net under the kids. Collaborative courts, you are technically charging them, but if they complete the program, they would be dismissed. But it once again becomes complex when they have these other charges going on that may be difficult to resolve. So any program needs to address the whole aspect. The at-risk kids, I think, is a really interesting thing, and it goes along with the research. So National Institute of Justice, which is part of DOJ, is actually, did they fund this current study?
Oh, Office of Juvenile Justice.
Delinquency Prevention, also part of DOJ. They fund an enormous amount of research, and there was a conference last spring where they brought together law enforcement research, and that room had a lot of people in it. And so you were asking about social science and law enforcement and legal aspects, and we sat in a room for, I was only there for 1 day, but it was 2 days, and try to hash this stuff out. And it is tough. Where do we need research to be going? What have we learned? Is it even worth doing prevalence studies, because they're so difficult? Should we be looking at more regional studies? We talked through all of it. How is law enforcement taking this information in and changing policy? And so it's something that we're working on, but it's definitely challenging. But was really, I think, helpful. And unfortunately, we don't have the funding to do that, twice a year. It's it took a lot of people doing a lot of penny pinching to make that happen. And then the at-risk youth, I think that's a tough issue. Obviously, we see certain numbers, but anyone can be at risk. And we've seen, white, well-to-do cheerleaders become sex trafficking victims. But yeah, obviously, young women of color are disproportionately represented. Foster care youth. National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has a whole initiative I was just mentioning about trying to work and making sure that missing foster children, there is some kind of accountability for foster parents who do not report when their children go missing because they're getting a check, or they don't want to bring stuff down on them, and making sure that they get into the system. We are really looking at everyone. I met with the Department of Defense. They have their own education system, which I didn't know, outside the Department of Ed. And so those kids are moved from base to base, and they might have parents who are deployed. Are they potentially at risk or vulnerable? I don't know. We haven't seen any studies. We don't know. But I brought it up to the Department of Defense because they asked me, like, what can we do? What should we be thinking about in addition to procurement? I said, think about your military dependents. Are they vulnerable because of a lack of stability at home? Somebody comes into their school, romances them, they don't have any friends. You just kind of look at that overall vulnerability. But
I'll respond to two of the questions posed just very briefly as far as who's at risk. And, my work is with adults, but Ann and I spent some time talking last night about housing being such a huge thing. And I know you've heard that from us now, from all of us. And that's huge, right? And we talked about how sex trafficking victims aren't viewed the way that domestic violence victims are viewed. And we hear about domestic violence shelters, which there aren't as many as you would think. I mean, I've personally made tons of phone calls trying to find housing for folks who are domestic violence victims, so you could only imagine how far less resources there are for. And we heard, right, from one of the panelists, for whoever was here at the last discussion, I think there's a shelter and there's room for 9 adults in LA County at this particular shelter. So, housing is huge. I think anyone who is hungry and homeless and unstable in those ways is at risk. And as far as arrests for related crimes, I've seen them. I've seen my clients who have been convicted of prostitution charges or solicitation charges come in with petty theft charges because they're stealing food. And that resonates with me. It doesn't necessarily resonate with some of the prosecutors when I'm looking at a police report and someone stole a meal. And some prosecutors and judges see it as mitigating when they are stealing food. Some don't. At the end of the day, the person's going to end up with a conviction. Neither the judge or the prosecutor is going to say, all right, well, they want their petty theft conviction, and they'll have no choice but to unfortunately plead or lose at trial in those situations. So yes, we see them, and I wish that that there was more of an opportunity to have a dialogue about why these types of crimes are happening and what is forcing people to do these things. And it's survival, but unfortunately that does not resonate with a lot of people.
And I will say, I think we know a lot of the risk factors. It's the evidence that's out there, and you hear the same things over and over again. Abuse, whether it be sexual, physical, back at home, family rejection, racism. There's just homophobia, transphobia, all of these things. And what was shocking to me was when a government official, who shall remain nameless, read a draft of this report. They're like, yeah, we get it. There's a link between homelessness and youth engaging in this. What else is new? Things not there, and that has to do around housing. That has to do around support networks. That has to do with trained and good foster care placement. There's just so many things that we could do, and a lot of it stems from poverty. But it's so big that people just don't want to address it. They get scared when you bring these things up, and they're like, okay, well, intervention. What can we do for intervention? So what can we do for once the young people or the adults are already in this, what can we do to help them? And so that's what's always mind-blowing when I'm in these meetings or these kind of types of things where I'm just, not this, but some of the meetings that we were discussing where it's I think we know what we need to do, and it takes money, and there's just the money, the funding's not there. And then back to your question about why are LGBTQ youth disproportionately, part of this population, and particularly LGBTQ youth of color. What we heard from our sample, and again, I don't want to make sweeping generalizations, but a lot of it has to do with culture, and a lot of young people who are second generation from the Caribbean or West Indies, Jamaica in particular, them being gay or them being trans is just not okay. And that kind of starts the whole thing. We had one young woman who was 15 when I interviewed her, so she wasn't quite 16, so she couldn't go into the youth shelter system. Her mother was Jamaican. She identified as lesbian. She had been engaging in survival sex with a man in the neighborhood. And she eventually couldn't take the mental and emotional abuse she was getting at home from her mom for being gay. So she ran away. She went into the youth shelter program at the age of 15. And after 2 weeks being in there, they found out that she was 15 and she wasn't 16. So they called CPS. They brought her into family court. They brought the mom in. The mom was like, oh, what is she talking about? I'm totally fine with her sexual orientation. She can come back home. And the girl came back home, and the abuse started all over again, and she had like a calendar that she would mark off every day until her 16th birthday, where she could run away into the youth shelter program, which, let me tell you, is not spectacular in New York, but that was like the best option for her. So I think that there's just so much that needs to be done, again, around the prevention side that's just not being done.
Thank you very much. And in fact, I mean, what you've pointed out is so interesting, because when I talked to Beth about Repair, which is the nonprofit organization that she and Claudia has started to deal with these kinds of issues, one of the things she said was, well, we also have to deal with economic inequality. And I said, wait. You can't solve everything, right? Let's take a little peek. No, it's connected, right? And I have learned from you, it's connected. If the law is a seamless web, so are these issues that we deal with are seamless. And somebody said that this morning, impossible, but we have to do it anyway, right? So thank you very much for your expertise. Thank you.